So picture this. It's 69 AD, and you've got the Roman Senate.
Right.
These are men draped in crisp togas sitting in these grand marble halls, and they are absolutely convinced that they rule the civilized world.
Yeah, they really believed it. Or, well, they pretended to.
Right, but then they wake up to this terrifying secret, because the center of the universe wasn't actually Rome at all.
Not even close.
No, it was wherever the most heavily armed men decided it was. So today's deep dive is taking us past the illusion of the Roman Republic.
The polite fictions.
Exactly. Straight into the bloody, chaotic reality of the year of the four emperors. We're examining how the ancient historian Cornelius Tacitus, specifically through his work, The Histories, translated by W. Hamilton Fyfe, how he characterizes this brutal struggle for power during the Principate.
A pretty wild ride.
It really is. We are going to unpack what happens when the polite fictions holding a society together are just violently stripped away. Okay, let's unpack this. I mean, to me, looking at the early Sugars, it feels a bit like a modern corporate monopoly.
Oh, how so?
Like, you have the board of directors, the Roman Senate, and they're sitting around pretending they're still in charge. But everyone is about to discover that the regional managers, the generals out in the provinces,
Right.
they actually hold all the cards. So if the Senate wasn't ruling Rome, who actually was?
Well, to understand the sheer magnitude of this collapse, we have to look at the architectural lie of the Roman Principate itself.
The architectural lie, I like that.
Yeah, because for nearly a century, right, ever since Augustus established the imperial system, the emperors maintained this very deliberate constitutional fiction. They did not call themselves kings.
Right, they were princeps.
Exactly, princeps, or the first citizen. And the Senate was allowed to pass laws. They could debate policy, administer certain provinces. It was this carefully choreographed performance.
Just to hide the fact that the emperor had the military.
Right. Total command over the military.
Right.
And Tacitus's central thesis in the Histories is that the events of 68 and 69 AD, they permanently shattered this performance.
Because Nero dies.
Yeah. The death of Nero extinguishes the Julio-Claudian bloodline. And in that vacuum, this deadly struggle for the throne demonstrated that the Roman state was based entirely on brute armed force. There was no constitution to fall back on.
See, I want to challenge the idea that this was a sudden realization, though.
Okay.
Because by the time Nero was, forcing senators to watch him play the lyre or just executing his political rivals on a whim, surely the Senate knew they were living under a military dictatorship.
You'd think so, yeah.
So was this constitutional fiction something they actually believed? Or was it just like a comforting ghost story they told themselves? Because acknowledging the reality meant admitting they were essentially hostages.
Well, Tacitus leans heavily toward the latter, but with a really scathing moral judgment.
Yeah.
He doesn't view the Senate as tragic victims here.
Oh, really?
No, he views them as complicit enablers. When Nero dies, Tacitus writes that a terrifying secret of state was divulged.
The secret of state.
Yeah, which was that an emperor could be made elsewhere than at Rome.
Oh.
Right. The moment these provincial armies realized they didn't need the Senate's permission to crown a leader, the Senate's authority just completely evaporated. And Tacitus describes the senatorial class of this era using incredibly sharp language.
Like what?
He characterizes them by their supple inefficiency, their nerveless servility, and what he famously calls a luxury of self-abasement.
A luxury of self-abasement. I mean, that phrasing, it suggests they actually found comfort in their own humiliation.
They did, because abandoning the grueling, dangerous work of actual governance for the safety of just, being a sycophant, that's a choice.
Yeah, a cowardly choice.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that Tacitus isn't just recounting history. He is performing a moral diagnosis. He wants to show how the degradation of the aristocracy, their willingness to trade moral courage for physical safety, that was the death of civic goodness in Rome.
So he's saying they brought it on themselves.
Pretty much. But we also have to recognize Tacitus's pragmatism. He was a man who navigated the highest levels of Roman politics himself later on. He was no naive republican dreaming of bringing back the days of Cicero. He explicitly notes that a monarchy was essential for peace. He argued that the price of the old republican freedom was perpetual violence and, factional disorder.
So he wasn't against having an emperor?
No, he accepted that absolute power was necessary to hold a massive empire together. He just demanded good emperors, and he chronicled the absolute horror of having to put up with the bad ones.
Right, and nature abhors a vacuum. If the civilian leadership is paralyzed by its own servility, like you said, the military is just going to rush in to fill the void,
Inevitable.
which forces us to look away from the politicians in Rome and look out toward the provincial frontiers where the actual power resides. So if the military is now, manufacturing emperors, we have to examine the incentive structures of the legions.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are talking about troops who had served, 14 years under Nero?
Yes. And those 14 years profoundly corrupted the military character. Tacitus makes it very clear that the soldiers of 69 AD were no longer patriots fighting for the glory of the Republic.
Right, the old days were gone.
Long gone. They had been structurally conditioned to prioritize profit over duty. Tacitus observes that the troops had come to love the emperor's vices as much as they once reverenced virtues in the older days.
Wow.
Yeah, they were driven by greed, by the promise of largesse, which were these massive cash donations expected from any new emperor, and a burning desire to just pillage.
So they were basically mercenaries for their own country.
Basically. Look at the troops stationed in Germany, for example. Tacitus writes that they felt plunder was infinitely better than regular pay. They spent their deployments dreaming of sacking wealthy towns right there in the Gallic provinces.
Let's drill down into the mechanics of that corruption, though, because it wasn't just a vague moral failing. It was an economic system. The sources detail this complete breakdown of military discipline through practices like furlough fees, which blew my mind.
Oh, yeah. The furlough fees are the perfect mechanism to explain why the Roman military collapsed into basically an extortion racket.
Right.
Essentially, soldiers were required to pay their uncommanding officers, the centurions, an annual bribe just to get time off, or even just to avoid the most brutal heavy labor and latrine duties.
Which fundamentally rewires the entire economic reality of being a soldier.
Oh, complete.
If you have to pay your boss just to survive your deployment, you are perpetually bankrupt. So you have to resort to banditry, or you have to extort the civilian population just to cover your furlough fees. It turns the Legion from a defensive force into an organized crime syndicate.
And when a military functions like a crime syndicate, its loyalty goes to the highest bidder, period. This financial desperation explains the mob violence we see in the sources.
Like mutinies.
Worse, soldiers literally demanding the execution of their own officers. Like the mob violence against Generals Valens and Aponius Saturninus, the traditional hierarchy was totally meaningless at that point. The men with the swords recognized that they held the ultimate leverage.
It reminds me of a modern private equity firm carrying out a hostile takeover.
Huh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. The soldiers aren't acting like a national defense force. They are acting like rogue, aggressive shareholders. They look at the Roman Empire, they see this massive treasury, and they demand the immediate liquidation of those assets for short-term dividends, the imperial donative.
Exactly.
And the generals vying for the throne are just proxy CEOs. The soldiers will install whichever CEO promises to sign the biggest dividend check, and the moment that CEO stops paying, they will violently vote him out and install the next one.
That structural dynamic sets the stage perfectly for Emperor Galba, the man who actually replaces Nero.
Okay, so Galba steps in.
Right. Galba steps into this highly leveraged, extortionate environment, and he attempts to run the empire on ancient, austere Republican principles.
Which goes over terribly, I assume.
Oh, disastrously. He refuses to pay the massive donative that the Praetorian Guard expects, and he issues this famous, unyielding boast. I do not buy my soldiers, I select them.
I have to ask, though, was Galba actually just a rigid, out-of-touch fossil, as Tacitus implies, or was he just mathematically trapped?
What do you mean?
Well, the imperial treasury had been absolutely devastated by Nero's vanity projects.
True.
So Galba refusing to pay the troops might not have been just a moral stance. It might have been the only fiscally responsible choice for a bankrupt state.
That's a fair point, and Tacitus does acknowledge Galba's fiscal reality, but he really critiques his political blindness. Galba's severity was, in Tacitus's words, too rigorous for these degenerate days.
Too rigorous for degenerate days.
Yeah. Basically, even if the treasury was empty, you cannot govern a corrupt system by pretending the corruption doesn't exist. You have to manage the reality on the ground.
Right, you can't just wish it away.
Exactly. And Galba's inflexibility makes him a fatalist. When he realizes his position is crumbling, he adopts a younger man, Piso, as his heir.
Oh, right.
And in doing so, Galba delivers this cynical, brilliant speech warning Piso about the psychological corrosion of ultimate power. He tells Piso that prosperity and flattery probe the human heart with a keen touch, and that the complacence of others, the endless yes-men surrounding the throne, will inevitably weaken his character.
It's a fascinating attempt to restore the fiction of dynastic succession, but without the biological reality. Galba is trying to pass on an authority he doesn't actually possess to a man the military hasn't even approved.
Exactly. And unsurprisingly, Galba is butchered in the Roman Forum.
Just brutal. Which brings us to the next proxy CEO in our hostile takeover, Otho.
Yes, Otho.
If Galba was too rigid for these degenerate days, Otho was tailor-made for them.
Oh, 100%. Otho understood exactly what the military wanted. He had spent his boyhood carelessly, accumulating massive financial debts. But more dangerously, he was driven by the whisperings of astrologers.
Wait, astrologers?
Yeah, particularly a man named Ptolemy, who had convinced Otho that the stars foretold his rise to the throne.
You're kidding.
I'm not. Tacitus uses Otho to show how personal vice translates directly into political catastrophe. Otho justifies his treason by arguing that inaction is deadly, and that the only difference between dying innocent and dying guilty is fame versus oblivion.
Wow. So he would rather go down in history as a usurper than be forgotten.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we see him executing the exact mechanics of bribery that Galba refused. There is that staggering detail in the source where a common soldier in the Praetorian Guard is caught in a legal dispute over a neighbor's farm.
Right, I love this story.
Also, literally purchases the farm out of his own pocket and gifts it to the soldier.
Yeah.
It is retail politics at the end of a sword. He is individually purchasing the loyalty of the men who hold the capital. It's like a runaway train where the passengers have tied up the conductor and are just holding a violent auction for who gets to drive.
That's spot on. But purchasing the capital isn't enough, because the secret of state means there are other armies on the frontiers.
Right, the provinces.
Yeah. Waiting in the wings with the battle-hardened legions of Germany is Vitellius.
Yeah.
And Tacitus presents Vitellius as the absolute embodiment of imperial decay. He's this caricature of gluttony and sloth.
The food guy.
The food guy, exactly. When the civil war inevitably breaks out between Otho and Vitellius, Vitellius barely even participates.
Yeah.
He leaves the actual logistics and tactical warfare to his rival generals, Valens and Caecina.
Vitellius's camp is described in the sources not as a disciplined military headquarters, but as a midnight orgy.
A midnight orgy.
Yeah. I mean, it is horrifying to consider the sheer scale of the power these men were fighting for, juxtaposed against their personal emptiness. You have Otho, whose primary motivation is massive personal bankruptcy and astrological superstition.
Right.
And then you have Vitellius, whose defining trait is an unending appetite for rich food. Neither of them has a coherent vision for the administration of law, or the defense of the borders, or the prosperity of the citizens. It is purely about survival and appetite.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to the core of Tacitus's methodology as a historian.
How so?
Well, he did not write history merely to preserve a timeline of troop movements and logistical supply chains. He wrote history with a strict moral object. He believed that the dry bones of military tactics were secondary to human character.
Character was everything to him.
Everything. To Tacitus, men like Galba, Otho, and Vitellius degraded Roman life because they left no room for virtus. Yet virtus was the ancient Roman ideal encompassing courage, excellence, and civic virtue. By replacing virtus with greed and gluttony, these leaders actively rotted the ideological foundation of the empire.
So while the military is carving up the empire and installing bankrupt opportunists on the throne, we have to look at how the civilian population reacts to this.
Right.
Because if the city of Rome is essentially being held hostage, plundered by its own protectors, you would expect outrage. You would expect resistance, or at least terror.
Instead, Tacitus records that the Roman populace treated the bloody civil war like a spectator sport, like it was in the circus or the theater. They had entirely abdicated their sense of civic responsibility.
They literally watched the violence from the rooftops, cheering on whichever faction was currently winning the street brawls.
Yeah, it's wild.
The fickleness detailed in the sources is staggering. The public was ready to clamor for opposites on the exact same day.
Oh, absolutely.
When Galba is murdered, they enthusiastically cheer for Otho. But then, just months later, when Vitellius's troops march into the city and take over, those exact same citizens are decking Galba's busts with flowers, piling them on the very spot where he was butchered.
It is pure, meaningless enthusiasm. The public is simply flattering whichever warlord happens to be holding the sword at that exact moment. They have internalized their role as spectators in their own subjugation.
Wow.
But out of this total systemic collapse, Tacitus does provide an exception. A glimmer of brutal stability arrives from the east with the rise of Vespasian, the fourth emperor of this chaotic year.
Vespasian commands the legions in Judea and Syria, right?
Correct.
And the contrast between him and the other contenders is stark. He is this indefatigable campaigner. He eats whatever rations he can get his hands on, he dresses like a common soldier, and he enforces strict discipline.
Very different from Vitellius's midnight orgy.
Yeah, totally. And Tacitus makes a highly unusual observation here. He notes that Vespasian was the first emperor who ever changed for the better after taking the throne.
This raises an important question, right? It forces us to analyze the structural isolation of the eastern provinces.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, does the structure of the Principate inherently breed tyrants? Or did Vespasian's specific geographic and military circumstances save him? It appears that his immense distance from Rome and his strict focus on active military campaigns rather than palace intrigue insulated him from the corrupting influence of the capital.
So being away from Rome kept him honest.
Basically. He was not poisoned by the sycophants and the luxury that destroyed men like Otho and Vitellius.
But, even Vespasian's rise requires a heavy dose of realpolitik. His success was not a triumph of pure, untainted virtue.
Oh, definitely not.
Because it was largely engineered by Mucianus, the governor of Syria. Mucianus is the ultimate political operator in this narrative. Tacitus implies he was a man far more suited to making an emperor than being one himself.
Yeah, Mucianus recognized that he lacked the biological heirs necessary to establish a lasting dynasty, whereas Vespasian had two adult sons, Titus and Domitian. So, Mucianus plays the role of the ultimate kingmaker.
And the way he executes this is a masterclass in the actual mechanisms of ancient power. Mucianus doesn't just, give a rising speech. He controls the eastern grain supply to Rome, essentially threatening to starve the capital.
Right.
He builds this massive coalition of eastern governors and client kings. He uses the specter of Vitellius's hostile Rhine legions to terrify the eastern legions into backing Vespasian as a matter of pure self-defense.
It's all calculated.
Completely. He manages the backroom deals and the sweeping propaganda campaign required to legitimize a usurpation. It proves that raw military might isn't enough. You still need the meticulous infrastructure of political management.
Exactly.
The constitutional mask had slipped permanently, and even the eventual victor had to play by the ruthless new rules of the game.
So when we synthesize Tacitus's account of 68 to 69 AD, we are left with a stark, uncomfortable lesson about the fragility of institutions.
Yeah.
When the foundational fictions of a society, the shared belief that laws matter, that civilian leadership commands the military, that institutions are permanent, when those are stripped away, laws lie asleep, as the translation perfectly captures.
Laws lie asleep.
Everything is suddenly judged by the sword. And the speed at which a seemingly eternal civilization degrades into a high-stakes protection racket is terrifying.
Which makes this history a mirror for you, the listener. It challenges you to look closely at the systems organizing your own life, whether that is your government, the corporate structure of your company, or just the social fabric of your community.
Right.
It asks you to consider how those systems would actually behave if the polite fictions holding them together were suddenly removed. What happens when the incentive structures break down and the rules simply stop working?
And that leads to a really profound tension in Tacitus's own worldview. He firmly believed that the decay of traditional morality, the greed, the sycophancy, the loss of virtue, was actively rotting the world.
Right.
Yet his own meticulously documented history proves a deeply unsettling point.
What's that?
The men who most rigidly stuck to traditional morals, like Galba with his unyielding discipline, failed spectacularly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Their very inflexibility fractured the military and sparked civil wars. So it leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to consider.
Let's hear it.
Does a stable society actually require leaders who are willing to compromise their rigid morals to manage the corrupt reality on the ground? Or is that very compromise the mechanism that eventually destroys the society from the inside out?
A question that resonates just as loudly today as it did 2 millennia ago. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Tacitus and the terrifying year of the 4 emperors. Keep exploring the mechanisms of the world, keep questioning the sources around you, and we'll see you next time.